Welcome back to another Pirkei Avot text explication video. I'm Rabbi Drew. We are now on the third chapter, the 13th text. Now this is a saying from Rabbi Akiva, an early 2nd century rabbi who has an interesting statement to say. It doesn't operate in the tripartite, the three-part statements that we've frequently seen throughout Pirkei Avot. It actually is structured a little bit differently. He starts off by saying, merriment and frivolity accustom one to sexual licentiousness. Or perhaps, merriment, schok, just sort of, merriment and frivolity, kalut rosh, or sort of lightness of head, the absence of a certain seriousness. So it's the opposite, it's frivolity. And what he is getting at is when people engage in these sorts of activities and just having fun, it's a lot easier to transgress into sexual licentiousness, erva. But then he goes on. Now that he opened with that, then he talks about 4 different things in also similarly terse manner. In fact, perhaps even more terse. So he says, tradition is a fence to the Torah. Tithes are a fence to wealth. Vows are a fence to separation or abstinence. And a fence to wisdom is silence. This is interesting. One of the things that actually strikes me really in a very clear way is the specific language he uses of using siag. Now, siag as a fence is found in the very first text in Pirkei Avot. So we had if you remember, the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, this assembly, this really great assembly. Men of the great assembly, this great conference. So they had said 3 things. The first one was be patient with the administration of justice. The second one is raise up many students. But the third one is va'asu siag laTorah, make a fence around the Torah. The exact same language. Now he talks about 4 siaging, 4 different fences. And the first of which is siag laTorah. And he identifies this fence around the Torah, as it were, as tradition. This tradition, and what he means specifically by tradition isn't sort of the fiddler on the roof, sort of tradition. He means specifically more of the oral traditions that surround the Torah, and sort of the oral law, as it were. The second one is a financial one, really interesting, or perhaps we could say materially, which is tithing, literally giving 1/10 of one's income. And especially in an agrarian society where they were giving a 1/10 of their harvests to priests, the Levites, and so on. There's a whole system, which is a topic for a separate time. So this is a fence for wealth, which is interesting. That by giving, which to some degree almost is perhaps even counterintuitive, that by giving 1/10 of one's income, that one protects. It's a fence for one's own material wealth, as it were. That's a really interesting insight. The third, I find this super, I really had not thought about this before, but vows. So vows where you swear something, you vow off doing something. You vow you're going to avoid a certain, it can be anything. You could say, I'm vowing off Diet Coke this week, or I'm vowing off bread, whatever it is that. But fascinatingly, it's a fence for really separation. That were it not for engaging in vows, that you might really separate of abstinence from a total thing, that here is just sort of partial, which is a really fascinating way of thinking about the vows as a fence. And the fourth and final one is actually reverse, as opposed to saying shtika siag lachachma, he says siag lachachma shtika. That a fence for wisdom is silence. Now, this is interesting because they largely were in a largely oral culture. They spoke very verbal, and one would expect that having a lot of speaking wouldn't allow one to engage in a lot of wisdom sharing. Really fascinating. And yet he says the opposite. He advocates silence. That silence is a means through which one could somehow protect one's already pre-existing wisdom and knowledge. Really fascinating move on Rabbi Akiva's part to point this out. I think what he could be going at is if one engages in, and this goes back kind of to the beginning, the opening of this entire statement, which is schok v'kalut rosh margilin la'erva, merriment and frivolity, that perhaps by speaking so much, one could engage ultimately in merriment and frivolity and be less engaged with speaking about wisdom. Because clearly what he is saying about being silent is not being silent about matters of wisdom. I think what he means is not just speaking at any particular opportunity, but thinking about how to deploy it wisely in the sake of wisdom. I think that's what he's going for. So really interesting wisdom that we have here from Rabbi Akiva, this opening of merriment and frivolity, accustoming one to sexual immorality, which is obviously, or sexual licentiousness, which is obviously not a positive thing. And then we have these other 4 practices that we can engage in that protect us and help us do well. All right, thank you so much. So yes, so just to run those 4 really quickly, that tradition, sort of the oral tradition, helps protect the Torah. The second one, which is tithing, giving away 1/10 of one's income, can help protect one's total wealth. The third, which is really fast, for me, this is the most fascinating of this session for me, which is vowing, swearing things off, can help protect one from really going over and really separating and really giving up a lot of what one experiences in life. And then the fourth one, which is silence as a fence to protect one's own wisdom, which is to some degree even slightly counterintuitive, but there's a way that it could work. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this was insightful and gaining insight into Rabbi Akiva's advice. And stay tuned for the next video, in which we will once again hear more wisdom from Rabbi Akiva. All right, thank you so much for watching.